I'm sure we've all been in friendships or relationships that have faded over the years. I'm sure none of us have the same friends or people we knew from 5 or 10 years ago. See, over time, relationships and the love we have for people fade and change due to changing circumstances or even us as people changing. And sometimes we can think of our relationship with God to be a bit like that. We can look back and see moments, maybe when we first trusted in Jesus, or maybe when we were really on fire for Him, and we think that God was more pleased with us and loved us more. But now, maybe we think our relationship with Him isn't what it used to be, and therefore He's disappointed in us, and His love for us isn't quite the same. We see our sin and we picture God saying, "How can you possibly still be falling short after all I've done for you?" In chapter 21 of Gentle and Lowly, we're wonderfully reminded that this isn't the case. God isn't disappointed in us. His love isn't a flustered or an annoyed love. He still loves us as much today as he ever has done. Ortland takes us to Romans chapter 5, verse 6 to 11, in which Paul is trying to convince us of how we can be assured of God's presence and his favour going forward. The verses say that Jesus didn't die for us when we became strong, in verse 6. He didn't die for us when we started to overcome our sinfulness, in verse 8. And God didn't reconcile us to himself when we became friendly towards him, he says in verse 10. God didn't step down and meet us halfway. He chased us when we actively ran away from him. The language used is that we were enemies of God. We hated him. And yet he still came to us and still loved us, which we see through Christ's death. See, the reason for this was to show just how great the love of God is, that it's nothing to do with who we are, but it's all to do with who he is. And see, if God was to cease to love his people, then he would cease to exist, because God doesn't simply just show love. In 1 John, we see that God is love. You see, in the death of Christ, we see that God's love is beyond any possible doubt. And so, if God was to love us when we were still his enemies, when we were actively rejecting him and running away from him, then there is no way that he would stop loving us now that we trust in him. Now that we're adopted into his family, he loves us just as much now as he did when we were enemies of him. When we sin, we should still make a thorough job of repenting, actively hating the sin in our own hearts. But we are to reject the lies that we tell ourselves that God has become a little bit colder or a little bit stiffer towards us. If we're in Christ, our waywardness does not threaten our place in the love of God any more than history itself can be undone. We can mess up, and we do mess up our earthly relationships. But because of God's great love for us, there's nothing that we can do to change or to mess up our relationship with him, to change how he sees us and to change how much he loves us. What a wonderful truth that is to be reminded of on a Monday morning.